Hello and welcome back to the second part of the documentary that we're showing called The Greatest Raid. The first half was about half an hour long, and this is roughly the same as well. In total, you're looking at 58 minutes. But anyway, let's stop me wittering, and we'll get back to watching the documentary.
At 2 p.m. on the 26th of March 1942, the Armada set sail, with 264 commandos and 357 Navy personnel on board. That's a total of 621 men. Only 227 would come back.
I had just enough light to read a book that I was reading, and I just concentrated on reading this book. The thought that crosses your mind is, I hope I'm going to be able to do my part, without being overcome by fear. We chatted to each other about what we're going to do, and we all went through it with our blokes. I and my four guys just went through what we were going to do. I certainly thought to myself, my God, I hope I'm not going to show fear in front of my men if I'm frightened.
Tense, I suppose, would be the thing. Anticipation, yes. Fortunately, I think we were more worried about it being rough, because it's very, as you can imagine, physically exhausting to be seasick all the time. But we were lucky. It was calm.
33 hours later, they arrived at the mouth of the estuary, and the captain of the Campbelltown, Lieutenant Commander Sam Beatty, instructed Tibbets to set the fuses on his bomb. He then began to creep up the estuary. Ideally, he'd have stuck to the deep water channel, the channel the Tirpitz would have used. But this would have meant hugging the northern shore right under the noses of the German sentries. So he had to go right down the middle, despite the fact that the water, even at high tide, was just 10 feet deep. To reduce the ship's draft, much of the heavy armour and the big guns had been removed. So if she did become grounded, she'd be a sitting duck.
We did go across sandbanks a couple of times and dragged a bit going over. But it was so quick that you hadn't got time to think, good God, if I'm marooned here, I'd be shot to pieces.
It's hard to know, really, what the German gunners in this pillbox were doing when the Campbelltown chugged by. I mean, yes, she'd been hurriedly converted to look a bit like a German ship, but she was trundling right down the shallows. You'd have thought that would have alerted them to the fact something was up, but obviously it didn't, because they didn't open fire. And nor did the guns at the next pillbox, or the one after that. But then, things started to go wrong. The RAF had finally agreed to stage a bombing raid, but the pilots had been told not to bomb if there was cloud cover in case they hit French civilians. Unfortunately, it was cloudy, and they hadn't been told what to do instead. So they just flew around, alerting the Germans to the fact that something was up.
Their flak guns turned very easily down onto the surface of the river, plus their searchlights.
With the Germans now suspicious, the Campbelltown's Heath Robinson modifications and fake German flag wouldn't fool them for long. And sure enough, they were soon challenged by a signal from the shore. But the British had a trick up their sleeves.
We found the German code books, naval code books, and the Germans didn't know we had them. And so we had the up-to-date passwords and countersigns, and we were using them. Much to the consternation of the German signalman, who was flashing signals asking who we were. And we were flashing back the right answers. we're a friendly force coming in for the night. We've got a damaged ship or something like this, you see, and putting them off.
Twice the Germans opened fire, but each time they were silenced by reassuring signals coming from the Campbelltown. This meant the ships could get nearer and nearer to the target. Eventually, though, the Germans realised that, yes, unbelievably, it really was a British raiding party sailing right through their front door. They managed to get to this point here, just 2,000 yards from the dock gates, which are kind of just round the headland. Maybe you can see it just over there. And all hell broke loose.
There was an awful lot of stuff hitting Campbelltown. I mean, it was absolutely hitting our poor little MLs, but Campbelltown being the big target, you know, and there was a sort of glare of searchlights.
And don't forget there was very little protection for the Campbelltown, because they'd had to strip off all the protection to make it lighter, so it'd be able to get up the river. So it's just astonishing it's managed to get there.
The air was filled with things that whistled, hummed and shrieked, and every one of them lethal.
The main focus for the German gunners was the bridge of the Campbelltown, where the captain, Beatty, was trying to keep a steady course by calling out steering directions. The chap at the wheel was killed. His place was taken by another raider who was killed almost immediately. So then a chap called Montgomery, who was a Royal Engineer, took over, and he was standing there thinking, what do I do with this? When suddenly there was a tap on his shoulder, and a voice said, I'll take it, old man. And it was Tibbets, the egghead, the brilliant scientist from Dartmouth, the man who designed the bomb in the bow, found himself at the wheel as the destroyer was on its final charge.
I remember a red-hot shell passing through the wardroom just over our heads and going on out and didn't explode.
If just one shell hit the rudder or the engine, or worse, the bomb in the bow, the mission would be over. But at this point it wouldn't have mattered, because Beatty was lined up on the wrong lighthouse, so he was heading for the wrong target. At the last minute, a searchlight picked out the lighthouse over there, the green one, and Beatty realised his mistake. He barked out an order. So Tibbets swung the wheel hard to the right to try and miss the jetty here, and then hard to the left again. And you've got to remember, he's in a ship that doesn't handle, doing 22 knots at night under a hail of enemy fire, and yet he managed to just graze the jetty there. It was just an extraordinarily brilliant piece of seamanship. They came round the old mole, really shifting at this point, and pretty soon you can pick out the dock gates. There they are, look. There they are. Maybe, I don't know, 500 metres to go. Really cranking it up now, the old girl. Imagine what it would have been like to have been doing this on that night in March 1942. Dark, searchlight, cannon, machine gun, massive fire coming from that bank. Aiming straight for that. What's the impact going to be like? It's going to be huge. Tibbets' 4-ton bomb right over the gate, and despite the firestorm, Beatty turned to his men and said, well, there we are, 4 minutes late. The Navy had done its part of the job brilliantly, and now in the 2.5 hours before Campbelltown blew, the army had to get ashore and create havoc. Yes, the Germans had fixed gun emplacements, and yes, they outnumbered the British by 20 to 1. But that was no problem, because the raiding party, remember, were commandos. They may have been picked for their intelligence and free thinking, but my God, they were tough. The backbone of their training was speed marching, and each commando unit would compete to see who could go the furthest in the shortest time. One group went 63 miles in 19 hours. Another marched 53 miles from Harlech to the top of Mount Snowdon and then down again in 17 and a half hours. And remember, they did this while carrying 60-pound packs on their backs.
Determination is the most important thing, even on speed marches, where our great aim was to get the chaps to do 15 miles in full kit in just under 3 hours, finish up on the assault course and firing, and then leisurely go up to the top of Ben Nevis. It's all part of mentally equipping them to do anything.
Not only was commando training tough, but it was also revolutionary. The regular army would stay fit by doing star jumps in PE kit. The commandos trained in harsh terrain in battle dress. They invented the assault course. In fact, their methods were so advanced, they're still used by elite forces today.
Determination, doing things which you thought you couldn't possibly do, like on the Tarzan course, on a rope bridge or the death line. And don't forget, the chaps and commandos weren't super men. They were ordinary chaps from all walks of life, but they were trained well, trained to get the edge.
Instead of doing weapons training on rifle ranges, commandos practiced in massive mock battles with live fire.
All the weapon training was geared to offensive action. A little example, the Bren gun was normally fired on the ground, but why not use it, firing it from the hip? And this was an innovation.
And they weren't just revolutionary with guns either. They also learned unarmed combat, stuff no regular soldier had ever even heard of.
How to tackle a bloke with your bare hands. Knock him out, spoil his prospects and pinch his weapon. And his gold watch too if he's got one.
The key element was getting themselves to convince themselves they could do anything. And you can only do that in the military sense if you train people to urge them on and overcome their inner fears and give them supreme confidence.
Back in Saint-Nazaire, the commando raiding party would need all that confidence just to get ashore.
We went up on deck and we went to the bows of the ship. Well, the 12-pounder had been hit. There were a lot of dead bodies lying around the place, a lot of blood on the deck, and there was a hole in the deck. And I remember Johnny Proctor lying there with his leg blown off, cheering us on.
When I came up on deck, there was a brilliant flash and a ear-shattering explosion, and I felt a blow on my knee, which I felt like a sledgehammer, and it knocked my knee on one side, and I fell to the deck. And I was lying there, and suddenly somebody grasped the rucksack and pulled me on my feet and said, "You all right, lad?" And it was Major Copeland. He said, "Bambo, lad, at port side. Don't hang about here, it's decidedly unhealthy."
Tibbets and Gough were there, and they were holding these scaling ladders, and these two chaps were laughing and swearing and so on. And I think we probably dropped maybe even 8 feet down onto the dock.
The next thing was Germans, and they said, "Handy hoch," and I said, "Handy hoch to you."
While Tiger was having a set-to with Jerry, the demolition teams were on their way to their targets. One of the main targets was this underground bunker, because down there, and I'm not absolutely certain how I actually get down there, but anyway, down there are the pumps that were used for emptying all the water out of the dock. Stairs. The job of smashing this place up was given to a team of 4 commandos led by Lieutenant Stuart Chant. Chant, a stockbroker in peacetime, had to place the explosives even though on the way to the pump house he'd been wounded in the left leg, the right arm and both hands. Unfortunately, the explosives had been pre-rigged in England with very short fuses. So, Chant sent his men back up to the surface in relative safety, knowing that when he lit the fuses, he'd have just 90 seconds to climb 7 flights of stairs and find his way through this maze of aerial walkways in the pitch black, because there was no light down here then, while pretty badly wounded. He was a brave man. Chant made it. And the pumping house was gone. And meanwhile, other teams were having similar successes with the winding houses at both ends of the dock.
I went up to my colonel and saluted him and said, "So we've blown up the northern winding house." And he said, "Well done, old boy." So I said, "I'm now ready to go back to England, sir."
At 2:30 in the morning, the surviving commandos came here, where they'd arranged to meet the small boats that would take them home. They were pleased as punch with the way things had gone. But the elation was short-lived, because the scene that greeted them out in the estuary was truly horrific. Almost all of the wooden MLs with their exposed fuel tanks had been blown to smithereens. According to witnesses, the whole estuary was on fire.
Chaps were drowning, there were pools of burning fuel on the water. You had to kick with your feet like mad to try and steer the raft away from the flames, and it was an absolute inferno. There was a sort of sea of black. You could see sort of sinking boats and hear shouts coming from the river and so on. And then very quickly, the colonel said,
it was obvious that there was no transport home. So he said,
"Right, we'll fight our way out of the town and we'll
split up into small groups and make our way severally across the Spanish border."
I thought that's a bit of a tall order.
Spain was a daunting 350 miles away. But even before they could set off, they'd have to fight their way out of Saint Nazaire itself. So that's 5,000 Germans who by this stage were awake, alert and organised, against fewer than 120 Brits, half of whom were wounded.
If you're street fighting, you must secure any crossing.
Tiger Watson came round this corner, found himself face to face with a German sniper.
Ran forward, saw him lean forward, pressed the trigger of my Thompson submachine gun, and typically Watson, the magazine was empty. Click, click. Unfortunately, his magazine wasn't empty, and his shot broke my arm and bowled me over.
A party of Germans ran up to him, and one of them actually used the cliched expression, "For you, the war is over."
And I thought, well, I shall have to, escape eventually, but don't feel quite up to it at the moment.
I was almost certain I'd be killed because there was a watch point, a tower, and I had to go past it. The Germans must have seen me, and I knew they'd fire, and they did, but they hit me in the back and the arm and the leg.
Chance, the stockbroker who'd blown up the pumping house, made it to this point when a machine gun bullet fired from the top of the U-boat pens over there took his knee joint out. He was no longer able to walk, so he was captured as well. The commandos realised that they were trapped on an island and that the only way off it and into the town was across this bridge, which was guarded by what must have seemed like half the German army. By the time they got here, there were only 80 of them left, but plainly they still had some fighting spirit left because they just formed themselves into a sort of great big mass and charged.
Captain Roy now led the assault across the bridge. Streams of bullets hitting those girders, ricocheting off the roadway. Machine guns, pom-poms, rifles. It was like a damn good November the 5th, only more so.
Bit by bit, the commando numbers were whittled down until the remaining men, low on ammo, went to ground in the town. Corin Purdon ended up in a cellar.
We suddenly heard all this shouting outside, and then the door burst open, and there were Germans standing there with their coal scuttle helmets and their weapons, looking terribly tense. Frankly, if I'd been there, I'd have chucked a couple of hand grenades down and finished us off, but they didn't. And the colonel, who had his pipe in his mouth, just sort of walked up the steps and said, well, we've done what we came to do, that's that.
As dawn broke, the battle was pretty much over. Just 5 of the landing party would eventually make it to Spain and freedom, and 222 would escape the horror on the few remaining wooden boats. Of the 600 or so men who'd come to France the previous evening, 214 had been taken prisoner, and 168 were dead. And worse still, it was now 7 a.m., 3 hours after the bomb in Campbelltown's nose was supposed to have gone off.
After we were washed ashore, we were put in the back of the lorry, driven into the town, and we were in this big room, and the Germans brought in a sailor. They fished out of the river and put him on the table and said, you try and revive him. And we tried to get the water out of his lungs, and by this time we were saying to one another, the Campbelltown hasn't gone up.
The British could only console themselves that despite the failure, they had at least fought like lions.
They were patting us on the back there, the Germans were amazing. They probably couldn't believe it that anybody would venture up into a submarine base heavily defended.
Some of the stories of bravery were incredible. Out in the estuary, one of the surviving MLs had gone head-to-head with a much more powerful German destroyer. The British gunner, a commando called Sergeant Tom Durrant, was asked to surrender on a number of occasions, but even though he'd been shot 16 times, he kept on firing, until he was overcome by the loss of blood and passed out. But the story doesn't end there, because the captain of the German destroyer was so impressed by Durrant's bravery that when he landed, he took the trouble to find the most senior British officer and said, look, I don't know who was on that gun on that little ship, but whoever it was should get your Victoria Cross. And he got it. One of 5 awarded as a result of the action that night. So the commandos had fought well, but all they had to show for it was a destroyed pumping house and 2 damaged winding stations. Even at 10 a.m, the Campbelltown still hadn't exploded, and by this stage the ship was crawling with German souvenir hunters. There was a real possibility the bomb might be discovered and defused. At one point in the morning, Mickey Byrne was marched along here, right past where the Campbelltown was embedded in the gates, and that called for a remarkable piece of acting. He couldn't look pleased that it was crawling with Germans, he couldn't look quizzical, wondering why the bomb hadn't gone off, and nor could he look afraid that it might go off at that precise moment, blowing him to pieces. Among the prisoners was the Campbelltown's captain, Sam Beattie, who was being held in a nearby hut.
I was interrogated by a German who spoke very good English. He discovered that I'd been in Campbelltown, and he was remarking that it was no good ramming a stout cassoon like that with a flimsy ship. At that moment, there was a bang.
The blast wrecked the gate. Thousands of gallons of water roared in, taking what remained of the British ship with it. And the German souvenir hunters? They found bits of them on the roof of the U-boat pens, 400 yards away.
A German petty officer rushed into the room where we were lying, saying, "We're going to shoot you all, we're going to kill you all." We just were so sort of exhausted and everything else that we were delighted that the explosion had occurred, and just said, "Please don't shout, just get on with it."
Hitler was so incensed that he later issued his infamous order that in future all captured commandos would be executed as spies. Small wonder. Damage to the Normandy dock was so comprehensive that it was not repaired until 1947, 2 years after the war was over. As a result, Tirpitz was denied a home base in the Atlantic, and as a result of that, she was forced to spend most of the war in a fjord in Norway. She was finally destroyed by RAF bombers in 1944, and incredibly, this mighty battleship, the pride of the German Navy, went to the bottom, having never sunk so much as a fishing boat.
In the smoke of giant explosions, the Tirpitz capsizes and sinks.
The price for rendering this great ship impotent had been high. 168 British dead, around 400 Germans and 16 French, shot by mistake by SS troops. Still, the attack did mean that Churchill could say to the British and the world, "We're not done yet." And it helped in France as well.
One very important thing is what the French Prime Minister said to us on our first return to Saint-Nazaire. He said, "You were the first who gave us hope."
And what of the men, the commandos and the sailors who brought them on this, the greatest raid of all? Well, Tommy Durrant, the sergeant who took on a German destroyer, was captured and died of his wounds shortly afterwards. The bomb designer, Nigel Tibbets, after he'd steered the Campbelltown into the dock gate, helped wounded men onto a nearby ML and headed for home. But his little boat was hit by machine gun fire, and, as his wife had predicted, he was killed. After being captured, Mickey Byrne was sent to Colditz. After the war, he became a journalist, and today he lives in Wales, where his hobby is reading poetry.
What a world we might have made.
Tiger Watson was sent to the Spangenberg camp. After coming home, he qualified as a doctor and ended up in Africa, helping victims of leprosy.
I can't imagine all my senses being so alert. You know, every sense of hearing and looking and your heart pumping. Well, it certainly will be the most exciting thing of my life.
It made you feel that you could stand up to the test. I think that was a relief to know that one didn't fall apart.
I'm sure the youth of today would do the same as we did. I'm sure they would.
I think that somehow or other it's such a strange thing that phlegmatic British do this sort of thing, and I could see us doing it again.
But I'm always reminded when I think about this, and it was after the war I came across a quotation by Mark Twain, who said that courage is recognising fear, courage is conquering fear, and that's absolutely true, couldn't be truer. Yes, you were afraid, but you couldn't afford to be a coward.
Today, the great moments of military history are marked with imposing monuments, and their anniversary is honoured with much pomp and ceremony. But to find a memorial to the greatest raid of all, you have to go to a car park in Falmouth, in Cornwall. It's just a rock propped up against some railings, and it seems rather small.
I've always had the feeling that anything that really offers some hope, whether it's international or national or even individual, some idea of your own, and it's impossible, never think so. Try it.
Good night.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that, because to be honest, it's one of the most fascinating stories of the war. For when you think of, the tenacity, the bravery, the teamwork and comradeship that needs to be in those men to be able to pull off something like that, and they succeeded against all the odds, and the odds were heavily against them, and the amount of people that actually did survive, and the fact that they managed to accomplish their target aim is just brilliant and fascinating, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it. But anyway, thank you very much for watching it. If you did enjoy it, then please make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, then please feel free to do so. I would like to say, if you enjoyed that sort of thing, then if you pop along and visit the Timeline channel on YouTube, subscribe to them as well. There's many different videos on there, and they're all brilliant, and the amount of research and production, the channel is just brilliant. So it's certainly well worth a visit. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time.